The morning Rosa Dugan received the notice from the land office. She read it 3 times standing in the doorway of the only home she had ever known, her hands steady even as her heart hammered like a spooked horse against her ribs. 3 days. The paper said she had 3 days to demonstrate that the 40 acres her father had left her were productive land, capable of sustaining crops or livestock, or the deed would revert to the county under the terms of the Homestead Consolidation Act being enforced across the whole of the New Mexico Territory in the fall of 1878. She was 24 years old, alone since March when her father Emmett Dugan had been taken by a fever that moved faster than any storm she had ever seen, and the land she stood on was dry, cracked at the edges, and stubbornly resistant to everything she had planted in it since spring. She folded the paper carefully and set it on the rough-hewn table inside the cabin. Then she walked to the fence line and looked at her fields. The corn had come up thin. The bean rows were patchy. 2 of her 3 goats had wandered off in July and never come back. What she had was a small kitchen garden with tomatoes and squash fighting through the dust, a mule named Copper who was older than her stubbornness, and soil that needed turning over in the south quarter where it had never been properly broken. 3 days. She pulled on her work gloves, walked to the barn, and picked up her heaviest hoe. She did not notice the man on the ridge until nearly mid-morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to throw shadows in the wrong directions, and she straightened from her work to stretch the burning muscles of her lower back. He was sitting on a gray horse up on the rise that overlooked her south field, just watching, not moving. Hat pulled low against the glare. Rosa Dugan was not the kind of woman who frightened easily. She had grown up on this land, had chased a diamondback off the porch with a broom at the age of 9, had once ridden 10 miles in a January ice storm to fetch medicine for her father. But a strange man watching her from a ridge without announcing himself made the back of her neck prickle, and she set the hoe at an angle in the dirt and crossed her arms and looked straight back at him. He stayed where he was for a long moment. Then he urged his horse down the slope, and she could see as he got closer that he was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a worn duster coat and trail dust on his boots thick enough to tell its own story about the road behind him. He was maybe 30, she guessed, or close to it. Strong jaw, dark eyes that she could see now as he pulled up at the fence line, and an expression that was careful rather than threatening, like a man who had learned to move slow so as not to alarm people. "You the Dugan daughter?" He asked. "I am Rosa Dugan," she said, "and this is my land." He looked past her at the south field which she had been tearing up with the hoe all morning, and at the corn rows beyond, and at the cabin, and at old Copper standing in the shade of the lean-to, and then back at her. "I heard in town about the land office notice," he said. "Half of Cimarron County heard it from what I can tell," she said, with an edge in her voice that she did not bother to sand down. The land office clerk had apparently not kept his business especially private when he rode out to post her notice, and she had already that morning turned away 2 men who had come to offer her low-ball prices for the property on the assumption that she was about to lose it. "I'm not here to buy anything from you," the man said. He seemed to read her face with some accuracy. "Then what are you here for?" He swung down from the horse in one easy motion and tied the reins to her fence post without asking permission, which irritated her in a sharp and immediate way. Then he walked to the edge of the south field and crouched down and picked up a handful of her soil and let it run through his fingers slowly. She watched him, not moving from where she stood. "This is caliche hardpan underneath," he said. "About 8 inches down. That is why your corn came up thin. The roots cannot push through." She already knew that. She had been fighting it all year. But something about hearing it said out loud by a stranger on her property made her jaw tighten. "I did not ask for your assessment," she said. "No, you did not," he agreed, and he stood up and looked at her again. "My name is Wallace Dunlap. I worked the Hearst operation up in Colorado for 3 years before I came south. Before that, I ran my own claim in Kansas. I know this kind of land." "Good for you," Rosa said. He did not appear to be offended by that. He turned back and looked at the south field, and she could see him calculating something in his expression, the way a man does when he is looking at a problem he believes has a solution. "If you break the pan," he said, "and turn the good topsoil down into the broken layer and add some organic matter, you can get that south quarter producing in less time than you think. You have got some nice loam in your kitchen garden. The whole field does not have to be hopeless. You need a plow and something stronger than that hoe and about 36 hours of solid work." "I have 2 days and 3/4 remaining," Rosa said, "and I have Copper, who is not exactly in his prime years." "Copper cannot break hardpan," Wallace said. He looked toward the lean-to. "But I have got a young horse and a turning plow on a borrowed wagon 2 miles back on the road. I could have it here within the hour." Rosa looked at him for a long moment. She was a practical woman. She had been raised by a man who believed in taking help when it was honest and refusing it when it had strings attached, and she was still not entirely sure which category this man fell into. "Why?" she said. "Because I came through this valley looking for work," he said. "And because I saw your field and I saw that notice tacked to the post at the crossroads, and I thought it was a waste of good land if it got absorbed by the county. And because I have been between places for a while and working with my hands clears my head better than anything else I have found." She studied him. There was something in the way he spoke that was direct without being aggressive, plain without being simple. He was not trying to charm her or soften her or make himself seem more useful than he was. He was just telling her what he knew and what he could do. "I am not paying you," she said, because she needed him to understand that from the front. "I am not asking to be paid," he said. "Then I am not owing you anything either," she said. "You work on this land, you do it of your own choosing, and I am not indebted to you for it." He looked at her steadily. "Agreed. And you follow my lead," she said. "This is my land and my decision about every inch of it." "Understood," he said. She looked at the south field. She looked at the sky, which had that particular blue depth that meant dry weather holding, no rain coming for days. She looked at her hands inside the work gloves, which were already blistered from the morning. "Go get your plow," she said. He was back in 55 minutes, which was faster than she had expected. He drove the wagon himself, a solid bay horse pulling it, young and deep-chested, and the turning plow on the back was not new, but it was well maintained, which told her something about the man. He worked the bay into the south field and began breaking the hardpan without ceremony or instruction, and Rosa walked the rows beside him on the far side, and used her hoe to turn the chunks of hard pale caliche that the plow threw up, breaking them further, working them into the soil layer the way a woman works bread dough, with force and patience in equal measure. They did not talk much in those first hours. The work was loud with the effort of it, and the sun was relentless, and there was too much to do to spend breath on conversation. But she watched him work, because she was not foolish enough not to, and what she saw was that he knew exactly what he was doing. He did not cut the rows too deep and lose the topsoil they needed. He did not rush the corners and leave hard edges. He adjusted his depth as he went, reading the resistance of the ground under the blade, making decisions without being told to make them. By midday they had broken half the south quarter. Rosa called a rest and brought water from the well bucket, and she poured a tin cup for herself and set one on the fence post for him without comment. He took it and drank, and they both stood in the thin shade of the fence for a few minutes looking at what they had done. "The other half this afternoon," she said. "Yes," he said. "And then tomorrow we mix what you have got." "Do you have any composted manure, old straw?" "There is a pile behind the barn," she said. "My father kept it religiously, 2 years of accumulation." "That is exactly right," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like genuine satisfaction, not at impressing her, but at the simple fact of the problem being solvable. "That will give us enough to work into the broken layer. Tomorrow morning we till it all together and then we plant." "Plant what?" she said. "I do not have seed left worth planting." "What do you have?" she told him. Some winter wheat seed her father had kept in a tin on the shelf, which she had been afraid to use because she was not sure it would take. Some dried bean seeds from last year's sparse crop, a packet of turnip seeds she had traded for in July and not yet used. The wheat will show germination in 72 hours if the conditions are right, he said. We can get it in the ground tomorrow afternoon. When is the assessor coming? Day after tomorrow, she said. At noon. He did the calculation in his expression the same way he had calculated the field earlier. That gives us time if we do not stop. Rosa looked at him sidelong. The sun had browned him well past the ordinary range, and he had taken off his duster coat and rolled his sleeves, and she could see that he was not a man who had been living soft. There were old rope burns on one wrist. His hands were calloused in the specific pattern of a man who had been working with tools and reins for years. He was lean in the way that hard work makes a person lean rather than the way hunger does. "Where did you come from before the road?" she asked, because it had been sitting in the back of her mind. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the broken soil. "Colorado," he said, "like I told you. And before that," he looked at her briefly. "Kansas. I had a claim there. It did not work out." "What does that mean?" she said. He turned his tin cup in his hands. "It means I built something and then it was taken from me in a way that was legal but not right, and I decided that staying there and being angry about it would not give me anything back, so I came south." She understood that kind of story better than she might have liked to. The law of the frontier was not always the same thing as justice, and anyone who had been out here long enough knew it. "How was it taken?" she asked. "Railroad company wanted the corridor," he said. They had surveyors reclassify the land, paid the county assessor to adjust the records. By the time I found a lawyer willing to look at it, the deed had already transferred. He said it without particular drama, just a plain recounting of facts, but she could hear the weight underneath it. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it. "That is the world," he said, "which is why I am not interested in watching the same thing happen to someone else when it can be prevented." She filed that away inside herself without responding to it directly. She handed him his tin cup back. "Drink the rest of it," she said. "We have got another half field to break before dark." He drained it and followed her back to the plow. By evening the south quarter was turned and broken, and Rosa Dugan was tired in a way that went bone deep, the kind of tired that feels almost like accomplishment if you let it. She had blisters on top of her blisters, and her lower back had developed a specific complaint that she was choosing to ignore. Wallace Dunlap unsaddled his bay horse and led him to the water trough without being told, and she noted that he knew where the trough was because he had been paying attention all day, not because she had pointed it out. She found that she did not mind that. She made a simple supper. She had cornbread she had baked the previous morning, and a pot of pinto beans she kept going on the back of the stove, the way her father had always kept a pot going so there was always something warm to eat. She brought a bowl out to the porch for him, and he sat on the step and ate, and she sat in the chair and ate, and they watched the sunset turn the mesa to the west every shade of orange and red it had in its collection. "You cook better than the outfit cook on the Hearst operation," he said. "That is a low bar if you have ever eaten crew cooking," she said. He almost smiled. She saw the edge of it before he brought it under control, like a man who had been careful with his expressions for a while. "It is," he said. "The stars came out hard and clear the way they do in high desert country. No clouds, no humidity to soften them, just the entire sky laid out like something spilled." Rosa sat with her empty bowl in her lap and thought about the land and the assessor and the wheat seed in the tin on the shelf. "Do you think it will work?" she asked. "The wheat?" He was quiet a moment. "I think the land can do it. I think the conditions are marginal but within the range of possible. The assessor is coming to look for signs of productive use, not to see a harvest. Green shoots on broken ground will satisfy the legal requirement." "How do you know what the legal requirement is?" she asked, and there was a sharpness in her voice that she did not entirely intend, because it suddenly occurred to her to wonder how much this man actually knew about land law. "Because I fought one of these cases in Kansas," he said. "I lost, but I learned the statute inside and out before I did." The The territorial homestead consolidation provision requires evidence of cultivation and planting, not harvest. If you have turned soil and planted seed and can show the assessor documentation of what you have done, that satisfies the definition. She let out a breath she had been holding somewhere at the back of her ribcage since she read the notice that morning. "All right," she said. "You should get some sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. He looked up at the sky. "I have slept under worse." She looked at him. He was serious. She thought about what it cost a man's dignity to sleep under a sky that could produce nighttime temperatures this late in the season, and she made a decision that was practical and not sentimental. "There is a cot in the barn," she said. "My father used it when he was minding a sick animal. It is clean." He looked at her with something careful in his eyes. "That is generous of you." "It is not generous," she said, the way she always corrected people when they attributed softness to what she considered simple practicality. "You are more useful to me tomorrow morning if you have not spent the night getting cold. That is all." He nodded and said nothing further, and she went inside to sleep. The next morning began before sunrise. Rosa was up when the sky was still deep blue-gray, and the stars were not quite done, and she was surprised to find that Wallace was already in the south field when she went out, driving the bay horse in slow circles to drag a section of old fence rail. She had not been able to identify the purpose of the night before. She watched him for a moment from the gate before she realized he was using it to level the broken soil, pulling the chunks of hardpan into a rough, even grade before the compost work began. She went back inside and made coffee in the old blue enamel pot, and when it was ready, she brought 2 cups out to the field and set his on the fence post where he would find it, and she picked up her hoe and began working the compost pile into the turned rows. The compost work was harder in a different way than the plowing had been. The compost pile was heavy and wet from the inside out, black and rich, and smelling of all the productive work of decomposition, and moving it barrelload by barrelload to the south field and working it into the soil was the kind of task that used every muscle in a different sequence. She worked methodically, which was the only way she knew how to work, starting at the north end of the broken field and moving south, mixing the compost into the upper foot of turned soil, and then smoothing it back so it would hold moisture. Wallace came alongside her after he had finished leveling, and they worked in a rhythm together. Not the awkward coordination of 2 strangers, but something easier than that, something that surprised her. She would move the barrow to a new section, and he would be already loosening the soil ahead of her to receive it, or she would be at the compost pile and he would have the next section ready. They did not discuss it. It simply developed, the way a good working partnership does, out of 2 people paying attention to the work and to each other. Midway through the morning he stopped and looked at the sky in a specific way, the way men read weather out here with their whole body and not just their eyes. "Wind is shifting," he said, "coming around to the southwest." Rosa looked up. She had felt it too, a slight warmth in the air that had not been there at dawn. "Rain?" she asked. "Possible," he said. "Not today, maybe tomorrow night or the day after." "After the assessor," she said. "After the assessor," he agreed. "But if it does rain, whatever you plant today will have a better chance." She thought about that. "The land does not often get cooperation from the weather," she said. "No," he said, "but it does sometimes." They ate at midday sitting on the tailgate of his wagon, and Rosa brought out the last of the cornbread and some cold salt pork that she sliced thin with her father's knife, and she brought the coffee pot because there was still coffee in it. They ate without ceremony, and she thought, in the back of her mind, that she had not eaten with a man since her father died, and that she had not particularly expected to. She had not been thinking about men. She had been thinking about survival. But she was thinking about Wallace Dunlap now, which was a different thing, and she noticed it the way you notice a change in the light, not dramatically, just a shift in what your eyes are drawn to. "How old are you?" she asked, which was a direct question that she would have normally kept to herself, but she was tired from 2 days of hard labor and her customary reserve was wearing thin. He looked at her with a mild surprise. 29, he said. I am 24, she said, which was not particularly relevant but seemed fair to offer in return. I know, he said. How do you know? You told me you have been working this land since March, and I know Emmett Dugan was here when this valley was first settled, which was 1872, and his daughter helped him work the place from when she was big enough to carry water. He talked about you in town sometimes. I passed through Cimarron twice before in 75 and 77. I knew who you were before I came up the ridge. She stared at him. You knew my father. I knew of him, he said carefully. I never met him formally, but he had a reputation for honest dealing in this part of the territory, and people talked about him with respect. I heard he died this spring. She looked away, across the field, because there was a thickness in her chest when people mentioned her father that she was not prepared to display in front of a man she had known for less than 2 days. He worked this land his whole life, she said, when she could say it evenly. He believed in it. I am not going to let them take it. No, Wallace said. You are not. Something about the certainty in his voice, not the gentleness, but the flat conviction of it steadied her in a way she had not expected anything to. They planted the wheat in the afternoon. The seeds went into the turned and composted soil in careful rows, not too deep, at the spacing her father had always used, and that Wallace confirmed was right for winter wheat in this altitude. She worked one side of the field, and he worked the other, and they moved toward each other slowly through the afternoon heat. And the planting was a satisfying thing, in a way that the breaking and turning had not been, because planting was an act of belief. Halfway through, she said, do you think you will stay in this territory? He was pressing seeds in a few rows over, not looking at her. I had not decided, he said. What would make you decide? She asked. Now he did look at her briefly across the rows between them. Something worth staying for, he said. She did not respond to that. She planted the next row with her eyes on the ground. When the sun was going low and the wheat was all in, and the last of the light was turning the broken soil to copper and bronze, they both stood at the edge of the field and looked at what they had made. It was not beautiful yet. It was raw earth, rough and new, smelling of the deep mineral smell of turned ground, but it was alive in a way the field had not been this morning. The bean rose, she said, and the turnips. Tomorrow morning, he said, first light. Yes, she said. She made supper again, beans and dried venison she had in the root cellar and the last of the cornbread from the batch she had made, and she started a new batch baking while they ate. She brought out the whiskey she kept on the high shelf, the bottle that had been 3/4 full when her father was alive and was now down to 1/3, and she poured a small measure for each of them because they had earned it. He turned his tin cup in his hands the way he did. She had noticed that about him, the habit with the cup, a gesture that was not nervous exactly but restless, like a man who was always in some part of his mind in motion even when the rest of him was still. Tell me about Kansas, she said. He looked at the cup. What part of it? The part where you built something, she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I came out from Tennessee when I was 20. My older brother had died in a farming accident the year before, and my father's land could not support both me and my younger brothers, and so I was the one who went west. I filed on 160 acres in western Kansas under the Homestead Act in 1869. It was sod country, flat as a table, grass as far as any direction you looked. I built a sod house in the first year and broke 40 acres and got winter wheat in the second year. By the 5th year I had a proper frame house and 60 acres under cultivation and a small herd. He stopped. She waited. The railroad needed a corridor that ran directly through my 60 acres, he said. Not around them, through them. The company sent a man out to offer me $800. My land and what was on it was worth 4 times that at the market prices of 1874. I said no. 6 months later, the county assessor filed a revised survey showing that my original claim boundaries had been recorded incorrectly and that the land I thought I owned was actually in a different parcel designation. The correction gave the railroad corridor free and clear. Rosa set down her cup. "That is robbery," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is. It was legal robbery, which is the most efficient kind." He looked at her. "I have seen what happens when a woman holds land alone in this territory. The men who come to make offers are not the worst of it. The men who work the law and the ledger books are the worst of it, because there is no one to hold them to account." "I'm not going to lose this land," she said. She had said it twice now, which was twice more than she usually needed to say something to make it feel real. "No," he said again, and in the firelight of the oil lamp on the table his dark eyes had a steadiness to them that she found herself holding onto in a way she had not held onto anything since March. She slept hard and dreamlessly that night, which was the sleep of a person who has worked to the absolute edge of their body, and she woke before dawn again and went to the kitchen garden in the gray light and checked the soil temperature with her hand the way her father had taught her, pressing her palm flat against the earth and counting heartbeats. It was warm enough, dry enough on the surface, which meant the roots would go searching downward, which was exactly what you wanted in a dry climate. Wallace was already up again, she discovered, but this morning he was not in the field. He was at the fence line with a hammer and some wire, repairing a section she had known was weak for 3 weeks but had not had time to address. She watched him work for a moment before she spoke. "I did not ask you to do that," she said. "I know," he said, not stopping. "The fence was going to let your remaining goat out. If the assessor comes and finds no livestock, it goes worse for you." She had not considered that specific angle. The assessor would be looking at the whole operation, not just the fields. She looked at her one remaining goat, a brown and white doe named Agnes who had survived the summer through sheer personal stubbornness, and she thought about what else would be visible to a man coming to evaluate the property. "The hen house needs attention too," she said. "I have 6 chickens, but 2 of the nesting boxes are broken and it looks worse than it is." "After the fence," he said. She brought him coffee and began working the bean rows and the turnip patch while he finished the fence and then moved to the hen house. And by the time the sun was fully up they had completed the fence repair, patched the 2 nesting boxes, gotten the beans and turnips in, and she had swept out the barn and put fresh straw down and made everything look, if not prosperous, then at least like a working farm rather than an abandoned one. By mid-morning they were back in the south field, and she was clearing the edges of the broken ground into a tidier perimeter so that the field looked intentional, looked like a farmer's plan rather than a desperate dig. And that was when, without quite meaning to, she looked up at Wallace, who was working the far edge with the bay horse pulling a small section harrow, and she felt something that she had been carefully not feeling for the past day and a half. He was graceful in his work, which was not a word she would have expected to use about a man doing field labor, but there was no other word for it. He moved with an economy of motion that came from years of knowing exactly how to place his feet and his weight and his hands. He pushed his hat back and wiped his forehead with his sleeve and squinted at the sky for a moment in that weather-reading way of his, and she felt the something settle in her chest and become a something she recognized. She had not been looking for this. She had been looking for a way to save her father's land and her own future, and yet here it was, showing up alongside her plow. She put her eyes back on her work and said nothing. In the early afternoon, with the sun at its peak and the heat shimmering off the broken soil, Silas Harp rode up on his black horse. Rosa knew him immediately, and her jaw tightened before he was even fully into view. Silas Harp ran the general store in town, but his real business was acquisition. He had bought 3 failed claims in the valley in the past 5 years, and he had a way of appearing at people's lowest moments that was not coincidence. "Miss Dugan," he said, from the fence. He was a thick man with a mustache he seemed proud of and a coat that was too good for this part of the valley. "I heard from Hendricks at the land office that your deadline is tomorrow." "Good afternoon, Mr. Harp," Rosa said, not moving from where she stood in the field. "I am busy." "I can see that," Harp said, looking past her at Wallace, who had stopped the horse and was watching from the far end of the field with his arms resting on the harrow handles. "I see you have engaged some help." "I have a great deal of work done," Rosa said. "My land is meeting the productive use standard." "Well," Harp said, in the tone of a man who does not believe what he is hearing but is too polite to say so directly, "be that as it may, my offer stands. $320 for the 40 acres, which is a fair price for land that has had difficulties producing." "My land is not for sale," Rosa said. She said it the way she said everything she meant, flat and without decoration. "Miss Dugan, I only want to spare you the trouble of tomorrow's assessment. If the land office determines the claim is invalid—" "It will not," Rosa said. Harp's eyes moved back to Wallace again. "Is this man a hired hand or a partner, if I may ask?" "You may not ask," Rosa said. "And I would appreciate you moving along, Mr. Harp. You are welcome to come back and do your shopping at the land office tomorrow after the assessor has completed his visit and found everything satisfactory." Harp looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man rearranging his estimates. Then he touched his hat brim in a gesture that was courtesy wearing the mask of condescension, and he turned his horse and rode back down the road. Wallace drove the bay horse to her end of the field. "Harp," he said. "You know him," she said. "By reputation," he said. "He acquired the Folsom claim in '76 after a land office dispute, and the Bower property the year before that. He has been to see me twice," she said. "Once the week after my father died and again last week when word got around about the notice. He doubles his offer each time." "That means he wants the land more than he wants to seem like he does," Wallace said. "I know it," she said. "My father always said Harp was the kind of man who only came calling when he thought he had the winning hand." "Is there something on the land he particularly wants?" Wallace asked. He said it in a considering way, not suspicious, just thinking. She looked at him. "There is a water source in the north corner," she said slowly. "My father always said it was the most reliable spring in this part of the valley. He had it surveyed in 1873. It feeds the kitchen garden." Wallace was quiet for a moment. "If Harp gets this property, he controls that water source. And every piece of land downstream of it," she said, "which is the Jensen Place and the old Callaway claim and 2 others." They looked at each other with the same understanding. "The assessor," she said. "Do you know who it is?" "He came through on the North Range 3 months ago when I was working briefly for a grazing outfit near Rialto," Wallace said. "His name is Terrence Burke. He is a county man, not a territorial one, which means he reports to the county commission." "Which is where Silas Harp has friends," Rosa said. "Yes," he said. "Which means your documentation needs to be airtight, everything in writing. What you planted when you planted it, what you have already produced this year, the survey record for your water source. Put it all together on paper and have it ready." That evening, while the supper beans simmered, Rosa sat at the table with her father's ledger, and she went through every entry he had kept since 1872, every planting, every harvest, every sale at market, every transaction, and she made a careful copy of the relevant records on clean paper in her own hand. She noted the spring survey date. She noted every year the land had produced anything. She noted the corn yield for this year even though it was thin, because thin was still production. Wallace sat across from her, and when she described what she was writing, he suggested additions, specific legal language about productive intent and cultivation effort that she wrote in beside her own accounting. His handwriting was better than she expected. "You went to school," she said. "My mother taught me," he said. "She believed reading and writing were the one thing no one could take from you." "She was right," Rosa said. "She was right about most things," he said, and the softness that moved across his face in that moment was the first fully unguarded thing she had seen from him, and it made her look away because it felt too private to witness. They worked on the documents for 2 hours, and when they were done, Rosa had a folder of papers that laid out 6 years of productive use on the Dugan 40 acres with enough specificity to make even a sympathetic to Harp County assessor work hard to dismiss. When the lamp was burning low and they were done, she said, "Thank you." He looked up at her. "I have not done anything yet," he said. "Tomorrow is the actual test." "You have done more than you know," she said. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and in the low gold light his face was different from the day face she had been watching for 2 days, softer at the edges in a way that the sun and the work had hidden. She felt the something in her chest again, larger this time, less easy to put aside. She cleared the papers and said good night and went to bed before she did something that she had not yet decided whether she wanted to do. The morning of the third day arrived with a sky that was the particular clear pale blue that comes before weather changes, and Rosa was awake an hour before the sun, standing in the south field by herself in the early dark, just looking at the turned earth and trying to feel whatever was in it. She had not been a woman given to superstition. Her father had been a practical man, and she had inherited his practicality. But she had grown up with her hands in this soil, and she believed in something about land that was not easily explained in practical terms, the idea that land could have a quality of willingness or resistance, that it could receive care or repel it, that it responded to the person working it. She pressed her palm against the soil one more time. It was warm. The seeds were down there in the dark, beginning whatever tiny, irreversible process seeds begin. She heard him behind her before she heard his footsteps. She had been learning to read his approach, the particular evenness of his walking, the slight pause before he spoke that meant he was deciding how to enter her space without startling her. "How does it feel?" he said. "Right," she said. He came to stand beside her, not too close. Exactly the right distance, which she had also noticed about him, that he seemed to understand instinctively how much space she needed. They stood in the dark field together in the pre-dawn silence, which was full of crickets and the distant sound of the creek. "What time will he come?" Wallace asked. "Noon," she said. "That is what the notice said." "We have time to water the kitchen garden," he said. "If you can run the water there this morning, the growing plants will make the strongest case. Show him the most productive area first, then bring him to the new field and show him the documentation. Lead with strength," she said. "Always," he said. She looked at him in the first hint of gray light. "You have done this before," she said. "Not just in Kansas. You have helped someone else through something like this." He was quiet. "Once before," he said. "A family near Trinidad. Mother and 3 children. Husband dead of a gunshot wound. The circumstances of which were considered accidental by the county, but which I had my own opinions about. The land office had a notice on them within 2 months. I spent a week there." "Did they keep the land?" she said. "They did," he said. "And did you stay?" she said. "No," he said. "I was not the kind of person who stays places." He paused. "I have been working on changing that." Rosa Dugan turned and looked at him fully in the gathering light, and he looked back at her without looking away, and she felt the full weight of the something she had been carrying since the first day settle into a certainty that was so clear it was almost frightening. "Why?" she said, and she meant it as a larger question than just the one word. He knew what she was asking. She could tell. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive but considering, the way he considered everything. "Because I have spent a long time being a man who moves through other people's lives and fixes what is broken and then keeps moving," he said. "And I am tired of it. I am tired of the road and the next job and the next county. I want something that is mine. And I do not mean land, though land is part of it." He stopped. Then he said, with a directness that she recognized as the same quality she valued in him everywhere else, "I mean a life that has roots in it." She was quiet for a moment. The light was coming up, the sky shifting from gray-blue to the first pale yellow at the eastern edge. "That is not nothing," she said finally. "No," he said, "it is not." They went back to work. The morning was the most intense of the 3 days because the approaching deadline had a physical weight to it. Rosa worked the kitchen garden with single-minded focus, carrying water from the well to the tomato plants, which were heavy with fruit she had not fully harvested, and to the squash, which sprawled wide and green and productive. She staked 2 tomato plants that had leaned with the wind, so they stood upright and visible. She weeded 2 rows of carrots that had been neglected and revealed the bright orange tips showing at the soil surface. Wallace worked the south field, making the rows look as precise and intentional as the work would allow, smoothing the edges, marking the row ends with small sticks she had painted white years ago for exactly this purpose, a habit her father had for field documentation. He laid out her planting calendar, the specific page from the ledger that showed the date of planting, in a visible place. At 10:30 she went inside and changed into her better dress, which was dark blue wool, more serious than the work dress, and she pinned her hair up. It was not vanity, it was strategy. She knew how women who appeared well-ordered were treated differently in official assessments than women who appeared desperate and disheveled. She had seen it happen to other women in the valley, and she had noted it. When she came out, Wallace was standing by the fence in his cleaned-up duster coat, which he had evidently brushed and dusted, and he had washed his face and hands at the well and pushed his hair back. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about either of their appearances. "The papers are on the table inside," she said. "Good," he said. "If he asks who you are," she said. "I will say I am assisting with the fall planting," he said. "Which is true." "All right," she said. Terence Burke arrived at 11 minutes past noon, which Rosa felt in her nerves as a deliberate small power play, making her wait. He was a trim man, middle-aged, with the careful eyes of a bureaucrat who had learned to control his expressions, and he arrived on a neat sorrel horse with good tack, which told her he was well supported by whoever was funding his travel. He also arrived with Sela's harp. Rosa felt a cold clarity settle over her when she saw Harp riding alongside Burke, and she recognized the cold clarity for what it was, not fear, but the absolute sharpening that comes when you see exactly what you are up against. "Miss Dugan," Burke said, dismounting, "I am Terence Burke, County Land Assessor. I believe you received the notice of assessment." "I did," she said, "and I have prepared documentation for you. Mr. Harp is here in what capacity?" Burke glanced at Harp. "Mr. Harp has a registered interest as an adjacent property holder. Mr. Harp's property is 3 miles from mine and does not share a boundary with me," Rosa said. "He is not an adjacent holder by the territorial definition." "I would like that noted." Burke wrote something down. Harp was doing the thing he did with his eyes, looking at everything except her face. "Shall we begin the inspection?" Burke said. She walked him first to the kitchen garden, and she watched his face as he looked at the tomatoes, the squash, the carrots, the green beans she had trained along the fence. He could not entirely prevent his expression from registering that this was, in fact, a productive garden. He made notes. "How long has this garden been established?" he asked. "Since 1872, she said. "My father established it in the first year of the claim. I have records of every crop we have produced here." She handed him the document folder. He took it and began reading, and she stood quietly while he read. Harp said from behind Burke, "The south field was not producing as of last month." "The south field has been newly broken and planted within the last 3 days," Rosa said without looking at Harp, "which is consistent with fall planting practice for this altitude, and which is documented in the planting calendar in that folder, Mr. Burke." Burke walked toward the south field, and she walked with him. Wallace fell in beside her without pushing forward, and she felt his presence at her left side as a steadying thing. Burke stood at the edge of the south field and looked at the turned rows, the composted soil, the marked row ends, the evenness of the prepared ground. He turned the folder to a specific page. He looked at the field again. "This is freshly planted," he said. "Winter wheat, beans, and turnips," she said. "All 3 have documented germination expectation within the assessment window." "You cannot show me germination," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost like a warning, like he was giving her an opportunity she did not understand. "I can show you the planted ground, the seed varieties used, the dates, and the soil preparation work," she said. "The territorial standard for productive use under the Homestead Consolidation provision is evidence of cultivation and planting, not demonstrated harvest. I believe you will find that in the provision text, which I have included in the folder as well." Burke looked at the folder. He turned to the page she had indicated. He read. He looked at the field again. Harp moved up beside him. "Burke, the question is whether this land is actually producing. The question," Burke said in a quieter voice than Harp expected, "is whether it meets the legal standard." He read the provision text again. He walked the full length of the south field, looking at the soil, the row markings, the visible freshness of the turned earth. He walked back to the kitchen garden and looked at it again. He looked at the hen house and the goat fence and the water trough. He looked at the spring in the north corner, which Rosa had walked him to deliberately, showing him the survey documentation for the water source, the 1873 survey record in her father's careful hand with the county seal on it. He stood at the spring for a long moment. "Miss Dugan," he said, "you have adequate documentation of productive use and active cultivation. Your spring survey is properly registered with the county, and your kitchen garden is clearly established and producing." He looked at his notes. "I will record that this claim meets the productive use standard under the consolidation provision." The air felt different after he said it. Lighter in some way that Rosa had been too pressed to notice it had been heavy until it was gone. "Thank you, Mr. Burke," she said. Harp made a sound that was not quite words. Burke turned to him with the expression of a man who had made up his mind and was not in the mood to revisit it. "Mr. Harp, the claim is valid. I would suggest you direct your acquisition interests toward uncontested properties." Harp looked at Rosa with an expression that she memorized, because she had learned from her father that you always remember the faces of men who have tried to take from you. Then he turned his horse without a word and rode. Burke stayed long enough to record his findings in his official book and have Rosa sign the page, and he gave her a copy of his notation. He was not warm exactly, but he was professional, and when he rode away she had a signed document in her hand that said her land was hers. She stood in the yard holding it until she heard Wallace come up beside her. "Well done," he said. She turned to him, and whatever composed expression she had been wearing for the past 2 hours shifted in a way she could not prevent and probably would not have wanted to. She felt the full weight of the 3 days come through her all at once, the labor and the worry and the grief underneath it that she had been keeping at bay with movement, and she let out a breath that carried most of it. He was right there, and she reached out and put her hand on his arm just briefly, just a touch, and she said, "I could not have done this alone." He looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face. "You would have found a way," he said, but he did not move away. "I would have found a harder way," she said. "You made it possible when it might not have been." Something moved in his expression that she was learning to read, the quality underneath the careful surface that was the actual man. He said, "You asked me on the first morning why I came down from that ridge." "I remember," she said. "I told you I was between places and I needed work," he said. "That was true, but it was not the complete truth." She looked at him. "What is the complete truth?" "The complete truth is that I have ridden through this valley more than once in the past few years," he said. "And every time I did, I told myself I was passing through, but I always came back through." He paused. "I think I was coming back for a reason I had not admitted to myself." She was quiet. "And then I came up on that ridge and I saw you standing in that field alone with a hoe and a notice in 3 days, and I thought, this is a woman who is not going to stop fighting for what is hers," he said. "And I have been looking, without knowing I was looking, for that quality in a person, in a life." Rosa Dugan held the land document in one hand and looked at Wallace Dunlap in the afternoon light that was beginning to go golden and long, and she felt a certainty about him that was not impulsive or desperate, but was the kind of certainty you have when you know the ground under your feet is solid. "Stay," she said. It was one word, but she meant it as all the words she had not said in 3 days of working beside him, all the noticing and the steadying and the something that had been growing in her chest since the first morning. He looked at her for a long moment. "Is that an invitation?" he said. "It is," she said. He reached out and took her free hand, the one not holding the document, and he held it the way a man holds something he does not intend to let go of. "Then I am staying," he said. They stood in the yard of her father's land in the late afternoon light, and the south field was planted, and the kitchen garden was green, and the spring in the north corner was running clear, and the whole of it felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. The weeks that followed had a different texture than anything Rosa had lived through in the years of running the claim alone. It was not simply that there was another person on the property, though the practical difference of that was real and immediate in ways that ranged from the repaired fence staying repaired to the wood pile being full for the first time since summer. It was that the presence of Wallace Dunlap had a specific quality to it that she had not known she was missing, which was the quality of being witnessed. She had been alone in her labor for months, and she had been competent and she had managed, but there was something that she had not been able to see until he was there beside her, which was that competence and survival are different things from being seen in your work and your effort and your determination by someone who understands the value of all three. He built himself a proper room in the barn in the first week, because he was clear about propriety and so was she. And he did it with timber he brought from the mill in town on the wagon, and with cedar shingles that he had clearly spent his last real money on, which she did not comment on but noted. The room was small and neat, and he kept it that way, which she discovered when she left him a clean blanket folded on his door one morning, and found later that he had folded it again into a crisper shape and set it on the chest at the foot of his cot with a precision she found both amusing and appealing. He was particular about things. She had not expected that, but she was coming to understand that Wallace Dunlap beneath the road-worn duster coat and the trail dust was a man who had strong ideas about how things should be done, and who kept them quietly and without imposing them on others, which made him a remarkably easy person to live alongside despite their very different styles. She was fast and intuitive in her work, responding to what she found. He was methodical and preparatory, anticipating what was coming. Together they covered more ground than either could alone. The wheat germinated on the fourth day after planting, which Rosa discovered in the early morning walk she had taken to make a habit of, and she stood at the edge of the south field and looked at the faint greenish tinge on the rows and felt something that she could only call joy, which was not a feeling she had spent much of the past year with. She went and found Wallace at the barn and said, "Come and see." He came, and they stood at the south field edge and looked at the green, and he said, "There it is," in a quiet voice that had more in it than the words. November brought the first real cold, and with it the reality of making decisions about what the winter would look like on the claim. They talked about it practically and honestly, which was the only way either of them talked about anything. The claim needed more seed for spring. It needed new fence posts on the east side. It needed the root cellar extended to handle a larger food supply. All of this required money that Rosa did not have in abundance and labor that she had in sufficient supply if it was theirs together. One evening in the third week of November, with snow threatening on the mountain to the west and the fire going in the cabin stove, they sat across from each other at the table where they had made the land documents together, and she said, "I have been thinking about spring." "So have I," he said. "I want to plant the full south quarter in wheat," she said, "and expand the kitchen garden east. I want to add a second milk goat and get rid of the idea of cattle for now because I cannot feed cattle through this kind of winter, and I want to build a proper hen house." "The hen house should come first," he said, "before the deep freeze. The chickens will die in that lean-to if we get a bad cold snap." "Agreed," she said, "and the east fence before the ground locks up." "I can have the fence done by end of week if we start tomorrow," he said. She looked at him across the table, and the lamplight was low and steady, and the fire was warm, and the land outside was quiet and waiting, and she said the thing she had been carrying for 3 weeks. "I want you to have a proper stake in this," she said. "Not hired help, not passing through. I want this to be yours as much as mine." He looked at her with the careful expression that she now knew was the face he wore when something mattered very much to him. "That is a significant thing to offer," he said. "I know what I am offering," she said. "Rosa," he said, and it was the first time he had said her name without it being attached to a practical sentence, and the way he said it made her heart do something inconvenient and wonderful. "I have been paying attention," she said, "for 3 weeks now, to who you are and how you work and what you value, and I am not a woman who makes decisions I have not thought through." "I know that about you," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been paying attention too," he said. "Since longer ago than 3 weeks," she waited. "I have been paying attention since the first morning on the ridge," he said, "when you stood in that field with your arms crossed and looked at a strange man watching you from a height and showed not one single second of the fear I could tell you were managing because you were too determined to let fear take up more space than determination." She felt warmth in her face, which was unusual for her. "I was afraid," she said. "I am not without fear." "I know," he said. "That is not what I said. I said you did not let it take more space than your determination. That is different. That is not the absence of fear. That is something better than the absence of fear." She looked at him across the lamplight and the table and the 3 weeks of working beside each other, and she said, "I would like you to stay here, on this land, as my partner." He said quietly, "As your partner in what sense?" She held his gaze. "In every sense," she said, "if that is what this becomes." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers where it rested on the wood, and he did not let go of it, and he said, "Then I am staying in every sense." The winter was hard that year, as winters in the New Mexico territory tend to be, sudden and cold and long in the middle and slow to leave. But the cabin was warm and the root cellar was full, and the chickens survived in the new henhouse Wallace finished 4 days before the first freeze. And the wheat that had gone in the ground came through dormancy under a crust of snow that Rosa had watched with her heart in her mouth for 6 weeks before the early spring warmth began to green it up again. Wallace proposed marriage in January, which was not a moment of grand theater but was exactly the kind of moment she would have chosen for him, which was to say that they were sitting on the porch on a cold afternoon with the snow on the mountains and a clear sky and coffee, and he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me." She said, "I would like to say yes." "Then say it," he said, and there was the almost smile again, the one that lived at the edge of his mouth. "Yes," she said, "I am saying it." He leaned across the narrow space between their chairs and kissed her, which was brief and warm and unhurried. And afterward she looked at the snow on the mountains and thought that her father would have liked this man, which was the most important thing she knew to evaluate a man by. They married in February at the small church in town, which was the only church within 30 miles, and which had a minister who came through on a circuit every 6 weeks. The wedding was small because Rosa had few people to invite, but the people who were there were real. Old Martha Calloway from the neighboring claim came, who had known Rosa's father since the beginning of the Valley settlement. Tom and Bess Jensen came, who ran the farm downstream and who had been quiet supporters of Rosa through the land crisis, though they had not said much directly because they had their own difficulties. And the minister, and his wife who played the piano for the hymn. Rosa wore her blue dress, the good one, and she put a ribbon in her hair that she had been saving, yellow ribbon that her father had brought her from Santa Fe years ago on one of his supply trips, and that she had not yet found the right occasion for. Wallace wore his clean coat and a white shirt she had not seen before, which he had apparently purchased in town the week before the wedding, and he stood at the front of the church looking at her when she came in with an expression that was the fully unguarded version of his face that she had been seeing more of in the winter months, no reserve on it, nothing held back. She took his hand at the altar and said her vows in a clear voice, and he said his in a voice that was steady and full of the meaning behind the words. And when the minister pronounced them married, Wallace pressed his lips to the back of her hand before he kissed her mouth, which was a gesture so old-fashioned and sincere that Martha Calloway made a sound in the pew behind them that was half laugh and half something wetter. Spring came in earnest in March, and with it came the full promise of the South Field coming back to life, the winter wheat green and strong and even, covering the ground that had been dead hardpan the previous August in a way that made Rosa stand at the fence every morning just to look at it. The bean and turnip rows showed their progress. The kitchen garden expanded east as planned. Agnes the goat produced twins in April, which gave them 3 goats, and then the second milk goat they bought in town in May produced a kid in June, which gave them 4. The flock of chickens expanded through the natural process of chickens, which Rosa had always found quietly miraculous. Wallace added a room to the cabin in April, working on it in the evenings and on the Sundays that were not full work days, building it with the same care he had given the barn room and the hen house, level and square and solid. He put a window in the east wall so it would catch the morning light, and Rosa understood without being told that this was the room he was planning for a future that included more people than 2. She told him in May that the future was already arriving. She said it in the morning before work, because she was not a woman who dramatized things, and she said it plainly, that she expected they would need the new room sooner than later. And then she watched his face do something that she had never seen from him before, which was lose every careful thing it had ever held and become simply, completely open with the kind of joy that does not know what to do with itself. He picked her up, which was not something she had expected and which made her make an undignified sound of surprise, and he held her with her feet off the ground for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and then he set her down carefully and put his hands on her face and looked at her with all the open joy still there and said, "Rosa." "I know," she said. "Are you well?" he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also going to need help with the east expansion of the kitchen garden, because I am not carrying heavy loads in July heat." He laughed, which was the fullest laugh she had heard from him, and she filed it away as one of the sounds she most wanted to keep in her life. The summer was hot but good, the way good summers in the territory are, with enough rain from the monsoon pattern that usually came in July and August to keep the wheat and the garden alive and the spring running. Rosa worked the claim with Wallace through the summer, adjusting her work as the pregnancy required adjustments, and she found that it required fewer adjustments than she had expected because she was strong, and the work was familiar, and she had a partner who watched for when she needed the heavy end of a thing done without making her ask. She had the baby in September when the nights were beginning to cool and the wheat was ready for harvest. A boy, healthy and vigorous, with his father's dark eyes and Rosa's determination, which she recognized in his face within hours of his birth in the way you recognize family. She named him Emmett for her father. Wallace held his son in the first hour with the expression of a man encountering something that completely reorganizes the landscape of his interior, and he looked at Rosa over the boy's head, and she looked back at him, and they were in the cabin of the Dugan 40 acres, which was now the Dunlap claim by law as well as by love, and outside the window the wheat was golden and standing, and the south field was full of life, and the spring ran clear in the north corner. And there was not a single thing left of the desperate 3 days of the previous August, except the foundation on which they were standing. Emmett Wallace Dunlap was named for a grandfather who had believed in the land, and a father who had come down from a ridge, without being invited, and stayed for every reason that mattered. The harvest that fall was the best the South Field had produced in the 7 years since Emmett Dugan had first filed his claim. Rosa and Wallace brought it in together through October, working in the cold morning light and the warm afternoon, and she thought about the first morning of the 3 days, standing in a half-broken field with blisters and a notice. And she thought about the ridge and the gray horse and the man who had looked at her soil and said this is solvable. Tom Jensen came to help with the final days of the wheat harvest, and Bess Jensen came too, and they ate a harvest supper at the long table that Wallace had built in the fall to replace the old narrow one, with good food and the last of the summer squash and a cake that Bess brought, and they talked about the valley and the coming winter and the plans for spring. After the Jensens had gone, Rosa sat on the porch in the cold dark with her sleeping son in her arms, bundled in wool, and Wallace sat beside her, and they could see the stars the way you can only see them in high desert country far from any town light, the whole universe laid out above the valley. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking about the first morning," she said, "when I stood in the south field before you came down." "What were you thinking then?" he said. "I was thinking that I did not know how to do it alone," she said, "and that I was going to do it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "And now," she looked at Emmett in her arms, small and perfectly formed and asleep with the absolute trust of infancy. She looked at the land in the dark, which she knew by feel now as well as by sight, every acre of it, every quality of soil and water and slope. She looked at Wallace beside her, the solidity of him, the patience of him, the man who had come to a ridge without being invited and found his way down to the right place. "Now I am thinking that the land my father believed in is going to be here for Emmett," she said, "and for whoever comes after him, and that is everything." Wallace put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they sat on the porch of Emmett Dugan's cabin, which was also Rosa Dunlap's cabin and Wallace Dunlap's home. And the cold stars wheeled overhead, and the spring ran in the north corner, and the south field was resting after its harvest, waiting for spring. 2 years on from that harvest, the claim had changed shape in the way that living things change shape. The east expansion of the kitchen garden had become a full second garden plot, and Rosa had started selling produce at the market in town, which was not something she had originally planned, but which had grown naturally from the productivity of the land, and her own inclination toward proving what good soil could do. She had regular customers, women in town who came to rely on her tomatoes and her winter squash, and the dried herbs she had learned to cultivate from a Mexican woman named Luisa, who came through the valley with her family in the spring of 1880 and spent 2 months working the market. Wallace had expanded the livestock operation, adding sheep in the second year, which suited the land better than cattle as he had said from the beginning, and which provided wool that Rosa began processing that winter with the help of Bess Jensen, who knew how to use a spinning wheel, and which became another small income thread that strengthened the whole. Silas Harp had largely stopped riding through the valley after Burke's assessment ruling. He had acquired properties elsewhere, up towards Cimarron proper, and his name came up less and less in the conversations that mattered to Rosa. The threat he had represented had not disappeared entirely from the world, because men like Harp were not unique to one valley, but it had receded from her land specifically in a way that let her breathe differently. Emmett, at 2 years old, was a person of decided opinions and tireless physical energy, who had discovered the appeal of the South Field's loose soil, and the kitchen garden's accessibility, and the chickens, whom he regarded as personal companions despite the chickens not sharing this view. He followed his father on the morning rounds with a serious expression that Rosa watched from the porch with something in her chest that was too large for a single word. Wallace had become fully of this land in a way that she had not been certain was possible for a man who had been so long in motion. He knew its qualities now as she knew them, its resistances and its generosities, its specific character in different seasons. He had stopped being a man who was passing through somewhere and become a man who was arrived. She told him she was expecting their second child in November of 1880, standing at the kitchen table where they had made documents together 3 years before, and he looked at her with the same open joy he had shown the first time, less surprised by the joy itself but no less moved by it, and he said, "Is everything all right?" "Everything is exactly right," she said. The second child was born in the long heat of July 1881, a girl this time, with Rosa's dark hair and Wallace's steady eyes, and they named her Clara, which was the name of Wallace's mother in Tennessee, who had taught him to read and write, and who had died while he was in Kansas building the claim that was taken. Rosa had suggested the name herself, because she had understood long before the child arrived that honoring the women who had made these men was one of the important acts of a life. Clara came into the world on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday she had the full attention of her brother Emmett, who was 3 years old and regarded his sister with a proprietary interest that was both endearing and slightly alarming, and who brought her things from the yard, rocks and feathers and a piece of bark he apparently considered decorative, presenting them at the side of the cradle with the solemnity of a small person making important decisions. The claim, by the fall of 1881, was producing enough to cover its needs and provide a surplus. Not wealthy surplus, not the kind of surplus that bought fine things, but the deep surplus of a well-run land operation, full root cellars and a full winter larder and healthy animals, and seed set aside for spring and money in the tin box on the high shelf for the things that needed buying. The water spring in the north corner ran through the driest August anyone in the valley could remember, which was the silent vindication of everything Rosa had fought for in those 3 August days 3 years before. One evening in September, Rosa and Wallace sat on the porch again as they did most evenings when the children were down and the work was done. It was cool and the stars were beginning to come out and the land was quiet in the way it gets at the end of a good growing season, settling into itself. "I had a letter from my brother James," Wallace said. She looked at him. "He did not have letters often." "What does he say?" "He is still in Tennessee," Wallace said. "Things are difficult there for him. He has 3 children and his farm has had 2 bad years." Rosa was quiet. She could hear the shape of what was coming without needing to hear the words. She was not surprised by the shape because she knew the man she had married. "He asked if there was anything here," Wallace said. She thought about the east corner of the property, beyond the expanded garden, where her father had always meant to break more ground but never had. She thought about the creek that ran the south boundary, which could support more than one household's water needs. She thought about what it meant to have family within a day's ride when things went wrong, which they always eventually did. "Write him and tell him to come in the spring," she said. "Tell him to bring his family and his seed and his tools." Wallace looked at her. "There is enough land here to support more than one household if it is properly worked," she said. "And I know what it means to be a person who needs a place to come to." He took her hand the way he had taken it at the table 3 years ago, the night she had offered him a stake in the land, and he held it in both of his, and he looked at her in the starlight for a long moment. "You know," he said, "when I came down from that ridge, I told myself I was coming to help with the land problem." "I know," she said. "I was not entirely honest with myself," he said. "I was coming because I had ridden through this valley twice before, and I had seen this place, and I had known about you from your father's reputation, and there was something about the idea of this land and the woman on it that I had been carrying around without knowing what to call it." She looked at him. "You never told me that." "I am telling you now," he said. 3 years after the fact," she said. "I wanted to be sure I deserved to say it," he said. "A man should not tell a woman she was already in his thoughts before he had earned the right to be in hers." Rosa looked at the man who had come down from a ridge uninvited and worked beside her without asking permission, and saved her land and made her a home, and given her 2 children, and held her through the losses and the difficulties that 3 years of frontier life always included, and she thought about what it meant to be loved by someone who considered the earning of it to be part of the gift. "You deserved to say it a long time ago," she said quietly. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, the same gesture he had made at the altar, and she felt it the same way she had felt it then, as something that contained far more than the gesture itself. "I am grateful every day," he said, "for the ridge, for coming down from it, for you not sending me away." "I almost did," she said. "I know," he said. "You had very good reasons to." "I had very good reasons not to," she said. "You knew about the caliche." He laughed and she laughed, and the stars came fully out over the New Mexico territory in all their desert abundance, and the south field rested in its late-season quiet, and the spring ran in the north corner, and inside the cabin Emmett and Clara slept in the new room Wallace had built with the east window, and the land that Emmett Dugan had claimed in 1872, and his daughter had fought for in the desperate clarity of 3 August days, was whole and living and full of the future. In the spring of 1882, James Dunlap arrived with his wife Eleanor and their 3 children, having made the long journey from Tennessee with everything they owned packed into 2 wagons. They were thin and trail-worn when they came through the gate, and Eleanor Dunlap had the particular look of a woman who has been surviving rather than living for too long, which Rosa recognized with her whole body. She brought them inside and fed them without discussion, and she showed Eleanor the root cellar and the kitchen garden and the spring and the lay of the property. And she watched the woman's face change as she understood that this was real ground, real water, real possibility. James and Wallace stood in the south field and talked about the east corner and the creek, and Rosa could hear, from the kitchen garden, their voices carrying the same quality of 2 people looking at a problem that has a solution. The valley absorbed the new family the way good land absorbs rain, and by midsummer James had broken the east corner with help from Wallace and had his first crop of beans and summer squash in the ground, and had started building a cabin on the creek side that would be complete before winter. Rosa stood with Eleanor one August morning at the fence of the south field, which was golden with wheat for the 3rd year running, and Eleanor said, "How did you keep it? When the notice came, how did you manage it?" Rosa thought about the 3 days. She thought about the hardpan and the compost and the seeds going into the ground by hand in the gathering heat. She thought about Wallace on the ridge watching before he came down. "I worked," she said, "and I let someone help me, which was the harder part." Eleanor looked at the field. "James says your husband came down from a ridge when you needed him most." "He came when he chose to," Rosa said. "The timing was his own, but yes." "And you let him stay," Eleanor said. Rosa looked at the wheat in its rows, the summer breeze moving through it in the long ripple that was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on this land, which was full of beautiful things. "I let him stay," she said, "and I have been grateful for it every single day since." The wheat moved in the wind. The spring ran in the north corner. The children's voices came from the yard, Emmett's and Clara's and James and Eleanor's 3. The future of the Dunlap land already in motion on the same soil that had once been cracked and thin and nearly lost. Rosa Dugan Dunlap stood at the fence of the south field and felt the full weight of what it meant to hold a piece of earth long enough to turn it from a survival into a life. And she thought that her father had been right about this land, had been right about everything he had believed about what patience and work and love applied to the earth could produce. And she thought that she had added one thing to his knowledge that he had not lived long enough to see, which was what happened when the right person came down from a ridge at exactly the right moment, and you were brave enough to say stay. She had said it once. She would say it every day for the rest of her life, in every way that a life could say such a thing, with her hands and her words and her presence in the same place, rooted and real and running clear as the spring her father had surveyed in 1873, which no one had ever been able to take from her, and no one ever would.